Part 1. A fearful cry to the church. I want to introduce the blind Jesus I met long ago. I entered the mission field at a young age. It was a traffic accident with a bus that led me to decide to devote my youth to the mission field. One morning during my graduate school studies, there was a small bus station in the neighborhood which waited for the first bus that would give a ride to the first passengers that day. It was rush hour, and I was in front of the line of people waiting. The bus had just departed from the terminal and was slowly moving toward the first stop where the passengers waited in a long line. It was time for the bus driver who was driving at that time to change shifts with the next driver. So, I saw a man in a driver's uniform seated right behind the man driving the bus, and they seemed to be engrossed in a conversation. That station was the first station to pick up passengers and was just a small station placed just at the turn of a corner where there was no distinction between the sidewalk and the driveway. The bus arrived a little later than normal that particular day, and people were worried about being late to work and thus were grumbling with complaints, urging and pushing one another to get on. As I stood in front of the line and was further pushed towards the direction of the bus, I saw that the bus driver was still chatting with his head turned towards the man sitting behind him, and did not bother to look my way as the bus approached ever closer to the passengers. It all happened in an instant. As all the frantic pushing brought me in close enough range, the bus just ran over my feet. With the sound of jolt, I grabbed my feet and stumbled onto the street. It was only then that the people were in shock and all surrounded me, yelling at the driver. "Sir, a man is injured." The driver would not have noticed otherwise from all the chatting going on with the other man. I was immediately taken to the emergency room. The shoes I wore that day were torn from my feet, and I had suffered an injury so serious that several of my toes had been yanked out. After that incident, I was so sure that I wouldn't be able to use that side of my leg for the rest of my life. My bones were crushed and the roots of my toes were missing. I heard the nurses whisper to each other, "It's been taken to the roots, in this case the toes will not be able to regrow ever again." As I heard people talking, I was terrified. I lay on my bed, buried my face on a pillow, prayed and thought once more. That's right, the time I attended seminary. I must remember my prayer to God at the dormitory. "Lord, when I graduate from the seminary, please fulfill your purpose and command and lead me to a missionary's path." Despite this fancy prayer, I had entered a regular graduate school afterwards and had completely forgotten about my determination and goals of the past. However, God did not discard the prayers of a worthless man such as I. And from that day I began to pray again. "Lord, if you cure my foot, I will leave everything behind and go to the mission field at once." As time passed, my severely crushed foot started to miraculously heal and even gained greater strength than before. And the rootless toes that were said to have no chance in coming back grew even more beautifully than before the accident. After I regained health, I hadn't the slightest of worries on what to do next. And the following years of missionary work, starting from pioneering churches to spreading the gospel in the mission field, were years of utter passion and hard work. If someone would ask me now if I could do it all over again, to be honest, I wouldn't be able to give an immediate answer. Though the mission works that started without any dispatched churches but with sheer passion were able to bear great fruit, financially it was not an easy option. And it was too difficult to handle at times when it came to supporting my family. As I led a busy life in the mission field, I had become a father of 2 children who had to grow up in a strange land and adjust to a rather lonely environment because their father was a missionary. I was thus all the more eager to provide for them, but my circumstances wouldn't allow it, and little seeds of complaints started to sprout in my heart. "God, it was my choice to live as a missionary. Even so, don't the children deserve your care? My wife and I did not have enough milk powder to feed the children, so they drank coconut water. Even the major supermarkets would run out of fresh milk, so it would take us an 8-hour drive down to the capital of Manila City to buy and stock up on our milk supply. 4 years into missionary work, I could not afford a car, so I had to rely on jeepneys to go from one place to another. To reach a church I was pioneering in an area called Galiano. I took 3 to 4 hour rides in a jeepney on unpaved bumpy roads, and once I arrived, besides my nose and my mouth, which I barely covered with a towel, I couldn't save the rest of my body from being covered with a blanket of white dust. And on my return I could not catch the last jeepney ride, so I had to take a 13-hour walk to get home. There was no one to hear or relate to my struggles. So the most I could do was to look up and grumble at the sky. Then one day, at the request of a pastor who came from Korea, I attended a special worship service at a local church as a translator. Some of the members of the church were visually impaired. Prior to a scheduled church visiting of nearby area where blind church members lived. That Sunday was a meaningful worship service where all members of the church and guests who brought the necessary medical supplies, food, and offerings from Korea participated. I was asked to translate the sermon of a pastor who visited the mission field from Korea for this work, and thus attended the whole service. The pastor's message began. He seemed to have prepared many words of encouragement to the visually impaired people who attended that day. Members of the church, we have gathered here today for a very special occasion. We digged wells into the villages of the blind, and we collected donations, collected groceries, and collected medicines for them. What a pity it is that these people cannot see. Serving and helping them in this disastrous and uncomfortable situation is what we must do. How heavy is this unhappiness, for these people have to cope in unfair circumstances and live a hopeless life that they did not ask for. We have to help and embrace these people with compassion. It is unfortunate for these people to not be able to see the beautiful mountains and vegetation that God has made. I personally find blindness the most unfortunate of many other impairments. A fearful cry for the church. Just then a young man suddenly rose from his seat. This young man was sitting halfway between the attendants and startled everyone as he stood up in the middle of the sermon. And he did not just stand, but stood raising his hand high up and yelling in a sharp, loud voice, "Pastor!" The young man was wearing sunglasses, dressed in shabby clothing, and his hair was uncombed and quite messy. Whether it was the pastor who was preaching, myself who was interpreting, or the seated crowd, everyone was silenced in shock. In fact, I was in the midst of feeling quite uncomfortable in interpreting the message the preacher was trying to convey at the time. It was mainly because this pastor was listing some excessive and over-the-line expression his account of the difficult situation of the blind. I do not know if the preacher intended to emphasize the need to help the visually impaired to the audience, but I thought he was doing it in an overly depressing manner. However, as an interpreter I could not simply change his words, and just as I was having these uncomfortable thoughts, the young man stopped the pastor from speaking. "Pastor, I do not think I can continue listening to your message. Please reconsider what you are saying, for I believe there is some falsity to your words that I must say I have to disagree to." He was desperately asking preacher to stop his sermon with a dumbfounded look on his face. And tears were already flowing in the young man's eyes. "I am sorry everyone. I did not intend to interfere in the worship service. But I could not just listen, because I did not want to be misunderstood as someone who agreed to the pastor's words about visually impaired people such as me." The young man was a member of the blind community that the church members were scheduled to visit. So he was wearing sunglasses during the service to hide the unnatural appearance of his eyes. The young man continued to speak with a trembling voice. "I will not attend this church from now on. In fact, I thought that until now, the members of this church were judged based on the words and standards written in the Bible. I believed that Christians judged happiness and unhappiness of man through the standards of the Word and did not think like the rest of the world. But by listening to the sermon today and seeing the people who agree to its every word with an amen, I think I have thought wrong this whole time. When the pastor preached today and expressed our visually impaired people. What a pity! How miserable! We need to help them because we have healthy eyes. We must comfort them. I believe blindness to be the worst impairment. As I hear your sermon, I realize that the standards you set to evaluate people are no different from those of the world. And I am honestly very disappointed. I do not desire to continue my life of faith with those that do not think in terms of the Word, for your opinions on happiness and pain are not any different than that of the world. The young man's voice had gotten stronger, and his face showed great grief and disappointment. Nevertheless, every word he said seemed to clearly justify all these emotions he was showing. The people of the world may pin us as the miserable, but if you are true Christians that place man's worth and value on the basis of the Bible, you would evaluate a man by turning not to his physical, but spiritual state, seeing if he truly feels happy or hopeless deep inside. If he's living day by day in thanks and not blame. If we are to be claimed as those that lead the most hopeless and miserable lives, I don't believe this is what the Bible wants to tell us. The people that once had scowls and froze on their faces while the man spoke, were now intently listening to his every word. And the once piercing loud voice of the young man soon changed to one of composure and sound reasoning. Must not the quality of man's life be based on how much he give thanks to the Lord? How much he urges not to commit sin but to live a clean life? Or how much he tries to overcome hardship with hope despite his physical disabilities? I believe these are the things we must hold on to in viewing and measuring life, and that only then can we learn of the true values of a Christian that the Bible teaches. What about Adam and Eve?